The autumn fog lay thick upon London that evening, curling about the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. The streets, slick with an earlier rain, reflected the dim glow of carriage lanterns, while the rhythmic clip of hooves echoed against the cobbled roads. I had spent the latter part of the afternoon at my practice, attending to a particularly dull case of rheumatism, and upon returning to 221B Baker Street, I found Holmes in his customary position, stretched upon the sofa, eyes half closed, lost in one of his peculiar states of contemplative idleness. The fire crackled low in the hearth, lending a degree of warmth against the evening chill, and I had just settled into my chair with the latest edition of The Lancet, when a sudden, urgent knock at the door disturbed our quietude. I glanced at Holmes, who had already shifted his position, his sharp gaze fixed upon the door, as though expecting the arrival. "Watson," he murmured, steepling his fingers. "That, if I am not mistaken, is the sound of a man whose nerves have been stretched to their limits." Mrs. Hudson's familiar footfall followed, and within moments, the door swung open to reveal a gentleman of distinguished bearing yet unmistakable distress. His evening attire was in disarray, his cravat slightly loosened as though he had hurried to dress. The flickering lamplight caught the pallor of his face, accentuating the deep lines of concern upon his brow. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the man inquired breathlessly, his voice taut with suppressed agitation. "My dear sir," Holmes responded, gesturing toward the chair opposite him, "you appear to be in some distress. Pray, sit. You have our full attention." The gentleman lowered himself into the chair with a trembling sigh, producing a handkerchief to dab at his damp forehead. His fingers, I observed, were long and steady, yet his hands bore the unmistakable signs of one accustomed to the rigours of delicate work, a surgeon's hands. "You have the advantage of us," Holmes said smoothly, studying him with quiet intensity. The man cleared his throat, regaining a measure of composure. "My name is Sir Leopold Harrington. I am a surgeon at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and I have come upon a matter so distressing, so utterly inexplicable, that I had no choice but to seek your expertise, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head, his expression one of polite detachment. "Proceed, sir." Sir Leopold clasped his hands tightly. "It concerns a patient, one Charles Whitmore, who was brought into the hospital late last night. He had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen, grievously wounded, yet what struck us all with horror was his demeanour. He hesitated, as though struggling to find the words. "He was laughing, Mr. Holmes, laughing as though in the throes of some perverse mirth, even as his life bled out onto the operating table." A shiver passed over me at the image conjured by his words. "You are certain he felt no pain?" I asked. Sir Leopold shook his head. "None whatsoever. He should have been in agony, but he laughed, an eerie, unnatural laughter that chilled the very air of the room. And just before he succumbed to his wounds, he spoke, a single phrase that has haunted me since." Holmes leaned forward. "And what, pray, did he say?" Sir Leopold's voice dropped to a whisper. "The cure is the poison." There was a moment of heavy silence in the room after Sir Leopold uttered those words. The crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of a passing carriage seemed, for a brief instant, the only sounds in existence. I felt an involuntary shudder course through me, for the imagery his tale evoked was profoundly unsettling. "Laughed, you say?" Holmes repeated at last, his voice devoid of emotion. Sir Leopold gave a jerking nod. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, it was ghastly. He was in a state of exsanguination, his wounds grievous and fatal, yet his body convulsed with laughter. It was as though he were in the grip of some terrible mirth, wholly divorced from the agony he should have felt." I leaned forward. "Could it have been hysteria?" "We considered that," Sir Leopold replied, "but there was no sign of fever, no indication of mental derangement before the attack. And his eyes, gentlemen, there was no madness in them, only—" he hesitated, "only a peculiar sort of peace, as though he knew something the rest of us could not understand." Holmes remained silent, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed upon the embers of the fire. "And before he passed?" he asked at last. Sir Leopold's throat worked as though swallowing back something unpleasant. His final words, he whispered them just as his pulse began to fade. "The cure is the poison." Holmes exhaled softly, then turned his gaze upon our guest. "Tell me, Sir Leopold, were his wounds the work of a common blade?" The doctor hesitated. "No," he admitted. "They were precise, almost surgical." Holmes gave a sharp nod, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Now that, Watson, is where the matter takes a most interesting turn." I studied my friend, waiting for some remark of incredulity or skepticism, but none came. Instead, he leaned forward, fixing Sir Leopold with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the man's thoughts. "You have omitted certain details, Sir Leopold," Holmes said. "Not out of deceit, I think, but out of a failure to perceive their importance. Allow me to assist you." The doctor blinked in surprise. Holmes raised a hand, forestalling any protest. "The wounds, you say, were surgical. That implies precision, which in turn suggests an assailant with a steady hand and knowledge of anatomy, not a street criminal. You mention no sign of forced entry, which tells me Whitmore was not attacked by a mere burglar. He was either caught unawares or, more likely, knew his assailant." Sir Leopold opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly unnerved. "Yes," he murmured, "that would seem logical." Holmes tapped a finger against the armrest of his chair. "Where was he found?" "In his lodgings, not far from the hospital." "Was anything missing?" Sir Leopold frowned. "Number that is to say, not that we could determine." Holmes's fingers steepled once more. "And Whitmore himself, what was his profession?" Sir Leopold hesitated, then spoke slowly. "He was a chemist." There was a pause, and I saw Holmes's lips curve ever so slightly. "Indeed," he murmured. "Then, Watson, we may have the makings of a most singular case." Sir Leopold shifted in his seat, glancing warily between us. "Mr. Holmes," he said at last, "what do you make of it?" Holmes's expression did not change. "I make of it precisely what the facts allow, Sir Leopold. A chemist is found stabbed with surgical precision, yet dies laughing, whispering enigmatic words as his final breath escapes him. The wounds are not the work of a common criminal, and nothing of apparent value was taken. That, in itself, is illuminating." I furrowed my brow. "Illuminating? But what does it mean, Holmes?" He turned to me with an air of quiet amusement. "It means, my dear Watson, that our unfortunate chemist was not the true target of this crime, but rather something he possessed." Sir Leopold let out a slow breath. "You believe Whitmore was killed for something he had?" Holmes inclined his head. "Undoubtedly. The question now becomes, what had he discovered, and who wanted it enough to silence him?" He rose abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot." It was not yet midnight when Holmes and I stepped out into the murky London streets. Yet the oppressive fog made it seem as though the city had long since retired into a restless slumber. The gas lamps cast their feeble glow upon the glistening cobblestones, their light swallowed by the swirling mist that curled around passing hansoms like a living thing. Holmes strode forward with his usual purposeful gait, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat, his sharp profile barely visible beneath the brim of his hat. I fell into step beside him, my mind still troubled by the ghastly account we had just heard. "A most singular case, Holmes," I remarked at last, breaking the silence. "A man stabbed multiple times, yet feeling no pain, laughing even as he bled to death. It defies all reason." Holmes gave a quiet hum, a sound I had come to associate with deep contemplation. "On the contrary, Watson, reason is precisely what will untangle this mystery. We lack only the necessary facts." His last words, "The cure is the poison." What do you make of them?" Holmes did not reply at once. His gaze fixed ahead as we turned onto a quieter street. At last, he spoke. A contradiction, yet spoken with certainty. If we accept that the dying man was not raving, but rather attempting to convey something of significance, then we must assume his words were meant to be deciphered. A light rain began to fall, and I drew my collar up against the damp. St. Bartholomew's loomed ahead, its great stone facade shadowed in the gloom. Whatever answers lay within, I had the distinct impression they would be most unsettling. The entrance hall of St. Bartholomew's was quiet at this late hour, yet there was no mistaking the air of unease that clung to the place. A lone attendant at the reception desk glanced up sharply as we entered, his gaze flitting between us with something approaching suspicion. Dr. Leopold Harrington informed the staff of our arrival, Holmes stated coolly. I believe you are expecting us. The man hesitated a moment before nodding and gesturing toward a long corridor. Dr. Harrington said you'd be wanting to see Whitmore's body. You'll find him in the mortuary. As we proceeded through the dimly lit halls, I noted the subdued murmurs of passing nurses, their eyes wary, their footsteps quicker than usual. It was clear that Whitmore's case had left an unshakable impression upon all who had witnessed his final moments. One of the orderlies, a heavy-set fellow with a ruddy complexion, stopped abruptly as we passed. Begging your pardon, doctor, he said to me, mistaking me for a hospital physician. But is it true, then, that the poor devil didn't feel it? That he laughed? I hesitated, uncertain how to answer, but Holmes interjected smoothly. Is that what you observed? The man shuddered. Aye, sir. It weren't natural. A man in his state ought to have been screaming in agony, but he weren't. He just laughed. He swallowed. A terrible sound it was, like he knew something awful that we didn't. Holmes regarded him for a moment before nodding. Thank you. That will be all. As we continued toward the mortuary, I could not help but feel that the spectre of Charles Whitmore still lingered within these walls. When we entered the mortuary, the air seemed heavy with the weight of death, thick and oppressive. Whitmore's body lay on a cold steel table, draped with a white sheet that offered no comfort against the unnatural chill of the room. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his eyes sharp and calculating, his hands steady as he began his inspection. I stood to one side, allowing Holmes the space he needed to conduct his work. His gaze moved over Whitmore's still form with the precision of a master craftsman, noting every detail, every incongruity that escaped the untrained eye. The wounds are not random, Watson, Holmes remarked, his voice low, almost to himself. A criminal might lash out in fury, causing damage in fits of rage, but these... He leaned closer, pointing to the victim's abdomen. These are the marks of someone with knowledge of anatomy, someone who knew exactly where to strike to cause the most damage while ensuring that the victim would bleed slowly and without resistance. I took a step closer, my own curiosity piqued. But that suggests a surgeon or a doctor. Holmes nodded, his brow furrowed as he examined the angle of the incisions. Precisely. And more than that, there is deliberate precision here. These wounds were not inflicted in haste or under duress. They were calculated. He paused for a moment, considering something more. I have no doubt, Watson, that Whitmore's assailant was intimately familiar with his body and the ways in which the human form can be compromised. His hands moved over Whitmore's body, tracing the arc of each wound, the way they intersected, the depth. A crude attempt at murder it is not. This was the work of a practiced hand. He stepped back, his gaze shifting to the room around him. Yet something more remains to be revealed, something that goes beyond the physical wounds. The cause of death is one mystery. What led Whitmore to this fate is another entirely. As I nodded in agreement, the eerie silence of the room pressed upon us both, and I felt the weight of something yet to come, something Holmes was already calculating in the silence of his thoughts. Holmes's hands moved swiftly, yet with the utmost care, as he lifted Whitmore's left hand, turning it slowly in his grasp. His fingers traced the fingernails with a practiced delicacy, as though feeling for something hidden beneath the surface. I watched, intrigued, as Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching in recognition. "There, Watson," he said, his voice filled with the quiet triumph of discovery. "Do you see it?" I leaned in, my breath catching slightly as I followed his gaze. Beneath the victim's nails, there was a faint residue, a dark blue stain that stood out starkly against the pale skin. It was an unusual color, unlike anything I had ever seen in cases of this nature. "Sir Leopold mentioned ink," I murmured, recalling the doctor's earlier comment, "but I see now that this is no common ink." Holmes nodded, his fingers hovering over the stain with a detective's precision. "Ink, indeed. But not ink, Watson. This, I suspect, is something far more significant." He lifted his gaze to mine, his eyes alight with that familiar gleam. "This is a stabilizing agent for a compound, something chemical in nature, and I believe Whitmore came into contact with it shortly before his death." I felt the stirrings of unease settle in my chest. "You think this is related to his laughter?" Holmes paused, his fingers lingering on the stain for a moment longer. "Indeed, Watson, and I suspect it is the key to unlocking the true nature of this case." He stood, letting Whitmore's hand fall gently back to the table. "Now, the only question is, what was Whitmore involved in that led him to this fate?" After our examination of the body, Holmes wasted no time in pursuing the next stage of the investigation. With his usual vigor, he requested access to Whitmore's personal records, which Sir Leopold promptly provided. The more we delved into the details of Whitmore's life, the more our initial assumptions were challenged. It was in the hospital archives that Holmes made his first important discovery. "Ah, Watson, here is something that may interest you," he said, his voice tinged with excitement as he flipped through a stack of papers. I leaned over his shoulder to observe the documents. Medical records detailing Whitmore's treatments for various ailments over the years, his admissions to different hospitals, and a notable absence of family connections. But it was a letter he had written to a colleague that truly caught Holmes's attention. "This is curious," Holmes murmured. Charles Whitmore, though he presented himself as a mere chemist, was deeply involved in experimental anesthesia. In fact, he was one of the few in the field brave enough to push the boundaries of what had been accepted in medical science. I blinked, surprised by this revelation. But surely, such a field of study would make him a notable figure in medical circles. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes alight with newfound interest. "It would seem that Whitmore's true passion lay not in routine chemical compositions, but in pioneering work with dangerous substances, substances that could alter human perception, even create the very state of detached euphoria that we witnessed in his final moments." As Holmes continued to sift through the papers, I began to piece together a picture of Whitmore that was both fascinating and troubling. His research, though groundbreaking, had the potential for great harm, and I began to wonder whether he had unwittingly involved himself in something far darker than we could comprehend. Holmes's search continued well into the evening. After hours of poring over Whitmore's records, Holmes suddenly stood, his sharp eyes scanning the room with renewed focus. "There is something we are missing, Watson. Something tangible, something physical." Whitmore was not simply a victim of his circumstances. He was part of a larger puzzle, one that requires us to examine his personal belongings more closely. At once he turned toward the victim's coat, which had been set aside during our earlier investigation. Holmes's fingers moved swiftly, searching the lining, the seams, and the hidden compartments that most would overlook. His expression remained calm, but I could see the spark of anticipation in his eyes. Then, as though on cue, his fingers brushed against something small and metal. He pulled it from the coat with a quiet exclamation of triumph. It was a small vial, tightly sealed, its contents appearing viscous and unsettling. Holmes carefully inspected the vial, noting the faint traces of residue inside. "This, Watson, is our next clue," Holmes said, his voice low and serious. "This vial was hidden with care, and I believe it contains the very substance Whitmore was working with, something that could explain not only his strange behavior, but the fatal consequences that followed." I regarded the vial, feeling a sense of foreboding settle over me. It was clear now that Whitmore's involvement in this affair went far deeper than we had initially imagined. The vial in Holmes's hand seemed to hold the answers to questions we had only begun to ask. Holmes pocketed the vial with deliberate care, and I could not help but feel that we had crossed a threshold, one from which there would be no turning back. As Holmes and I left the austere confines of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the fog had grown thicker, swallowing the lanterns that lined the streets and turning the world into a blur of shifting shadows. The air hung heavy, pressing down on us with a kind of oppressive silence, and I could not shake the sense that we were being watched. Holmes's pace remained unaffected by the elements, though his brow furrowed with thought. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked, breaking the quiet. "This case has a certain tangibility that I cannot ignore." Before I could respond, a figure emerged from the mist, a man dressed in the dark coat and stethoscope of a surgeon. His gait was quick, almost nervous, and as he drew closer, I saw that his face was pale, his eyes darting around as though he feared being followed. "Holmes, Dr. Watson." The voice was familiar, but laced with an unmistakable tension. The man stopped just a few paces away, looking over his shoulder before speaking again. "I must speak with you," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about Whitmore, the man you're investigating." I glanced at Holmes, who studied the man with an air of detached curiosity. "Dr. Samuel Royce, I presume?" The surgeon nodded, his gaze still scanning the surrounding fog. "Yes, and I warn you, you must stop your inquiries. Whitmore's death. There are things you don't know. Things that could be very dangerous." Holmes did not react immediately, but allowed the man to speak. Dr. Royce's hands, which were trembling ever so slightly, betrayed his anxiety. He was not merely a man with knowledge to share, but one who was burdened by something much darker. "You're concerned about your involvement?" Holmes asked, his voice calm and even. "Or perhaps about the things Whitmore might have known?" Dr. Royce swallowed hard, his nervousness escalating. "I don't know what he knew, but I know what he was involved in. It was never meant to be exposed. Not like this." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "There are those who would go to any lengths to ensure it stays buried." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "You believe someone intends to silence me then?" The surgeon did not respond directly, but the fear in his eyes spoke volumes. I observed Holmes closely as he listened to Dr. Royce's warning, noting his complete lack of visible reaction. Where I might have felt unsettled by the surgeon's frantic tone, Holmes remained as composed as ever, his expression unreadable. As Dr. Royce continued to stammer and fret, Holmes shifted his focus to the man's subtle physical movements, his trembling hands, the nervous fidgeting of his fingers, the occasional glance over his shoulder. "You are afraid, Dr. Royce," Holmes said quietly, his voice sharp and direct. "But you are not guilty. In fact, I believe your involvement in this case is minimal. Your actions, however, are those of a man caught between fear and the desire to keep his secrets hidden." The surgeon's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he opened his mouth as though to protest. But Holmes held up a hand, silencing him. "You see," Holmes continued, "the subtle tremors in your hands, the rapid eye movements, and the deliberate avoidance of direct eye contact all point to a singular truth. You are not complicit, Dr. Royce. You are merely a man caught in the web of something far larger than you, and it is that fear which drives you to warn us." Dr. Royce took a step back, his breath catching. "How could you know all that?" Holmes's lips curled ever so slightly, the barest hint of a smile. "The signs were clear, Doctor. Royce, one does not need to be a detective to see when a man is afraid for his life." The surgeon's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I cannot speak further. You must find the truth before it's too late. Holmes studied him for a moment longer before nodding. We will, Doctor. Royce, and you need not fear us. We are not your enemies, but your best hope of uncovering the truth. It was near midnight when I was abruptly roused from sleep. A strange sound echoed from downstairs, a muffled thud, followed by the faint creak of floorboards. For a moment I lay still, straining my ears in the darkness. But when the noise came again, more distinct this time, I realized that something was amiss. I glanced at the clock. It was well past the hour, and Holmes had not yet retired for the night. Without hesitation, I threw on my dressing gown and hurried toward the staircase. As I reached the landing, I noticed a flickering light coming from beneath the door to Holmes's study. A small, suspicious sign that something was out of place. I gently turned the doorknob, my heart quickening in anticipation of what I might find. To my surprise, the door opened without resistance, revealing the study, illuminated only by the dim glow of the hearth's dying embers. Holmes's desk, usually neat and orderly, was in disarray. Books lay scattered across the floor, and papers were strewn haphazardly across the desk. But the most troubling sight was the absence of Holmes himself. He was nowhere to be seen. My first instinct was to call for him, but before I could, I heard the faint sound of a door shutting at the back of the house. I rushed to the window, but the street below was empty, the fog thickening as though it had swallowed any trace of movement. With a growing sense of unease, I moved to Holmes's desk and began examining the room. The disruption was clear. Someone had been here. Someone who was both deliberate and hurried in their search. But why? And what had they taken? Holmes had always prided himself on his ability to keep his most sensitive materials well guarded, and I could not help but feel the weight of that pride now. It was clear that the intruder had been after something specific, a key piece of evidence that had been hidden from view. Yet as I searched the room, nothing seemed immediately absent. Nothing obvious had been taken. The drawers were in disarray, but they appeared to have been rifled through without method, as if the intruder had been searching in a panic. I stood for a moment, my mind racing. What had they hoped to find? And more importantly, what had they taken? Then, as if guided by some internal instinct, I turned to the small table near the window. There, in the farthest corner of the room, I noticed something odd. A single empty space on the shelf where a vial had once rested. The realization hit me like a sudden thunderclap. The small metal vial Holmes had discovered earlier, the one containing an unknown substance from Whitmore's coat. It was gone. The vial had been carefully tucked away, almost as if it held the secret to the entire mystery. I quickly stepped back, searching the room once more. No trace of it. Whoever had been in here knew exactly what they were looking for. They had found it, and now it was gone. I felt a pang of fear. Someone was desperate to erase any evidence, to hide the truth. I turned to the door just as Holmes appeared in the hallway, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He had evidently returned at some point during my search, but I had not noticed his presence. "What's happened, Watson?" "I'm afraid we've been visited," I said quietly, my voice edged with concern. "And the most important clue we've found has been taken." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his gaze hardening. "Then it seems we have a more pressing problem than we initially thought, Watson." As I stood there, staring at the empty space where the vial had once been, a deep sense of unease settled in my chest. The implications of this theft were far-reaching, and I could not help but feel the growing weight of the situation. Someone was actively working against us, erasing vital clues from right under our noses. I turned to Holmes, seeking some measure of reassurance, but his expression remained as impassive as ever. He stood calmly, his hands folded behind his back, as though the disappearance of the vial was but a minor inconvenience. "What do we do now, Holmes?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. "This seems to be escalating rapidly." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained steady. "It is not the escalation that concerns me, Watson. It is the deliberate intent behind it. The thief knew exactly what they were looking for. The vial. This was no chance occurrence. Whoever it was, they sought information, and they believe it lies within the contents of that vial. I shook my head, still struggling to understand. But why would anyone want this vial, Holmes? It could be just another chemical compound, nothing of particular note. Holmes looked at me, a faint but amused smile playing on his lips. Watson, if there is one thing I have learned in my years of investigation, it is that nothing is ever without significance. If someone went to the trouble of breaking into my study to steal this vial, it is because they know its importance. Perhaps more than we do at this stage. He took a slow step forward, his eyes focused on the space where the vial had once been. Now we must work quickly. The thief will not be far, and we must remain one step ahead. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, formulating his next steps with that unrivaled brilliance I had come to expect from him. Without hesitation, he turned toward me, his voice calm but carrying the weight of decisive action. "We must make our way to Whitmore's laboratory at once," he said, his eyes gleaming with determination. "If we are to understand the true nature of what he was working on, we must examine the place where it all began. There, we will find the clues that the thief has overlooked, or perhaps the ones they fear most." I nodded, understanding the urgency in his words, yet feeling the same unease I had earlier. What lay in Whitmore's laboratory that could provide answers? More importantly, who was it that sought to prevent us from uncovering the truth? "There may still be evidence there," Holmes continued, already moving toward the door. "And it is crucial we reach it before our unknown adversary can destroy more of it. We must act swiftly, Watson." With that, we set out into the foggy streets of London, our minds filled with the mystery that now seemed to grow more complicated by the hour. Holmes and I arrived at Whitmore's laboratory as the evening mist clung to the streets, thick and oppressive. The lab itself was located on the outskirts of the city, in a narrow, somewhat forgotten alleyway, and the building, like many of its kind, had a derelict quality to it. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of old chemicals lingered as we stepped inside. The door creaked open with little resistance, and I noticed immediately that the lab appeared abandoned, not by choice, but by necessity. The shelves were cluttered with half-finished experiments, some of them unstable by the look of the apparatus, while others lay scattered across tables, abandoned mid-reaction. A fine layer of dust had settled over everything, suggesting it had been some time since the place had seen any use. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the room with methodical precision, his attention to detail unwavering. "It would seem, Watson," he said, his voice low, "that Whitmore left this place in a great hurry, or was perhaps forced to leave it behind. Notice how the equipment is still intact, yet the work has been abandoned midway, as though he was interrupted before completing his tasks." I nodded, my gaze shifting across the lab. The sight of shattered glassware, carelessly discarded on the floor, only reinforced Holmes's observation. It was clear that Whitmore had not left voluntarily. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something dangerous had unfolded here, something dark enough to cause the chemist's sudden disappearance. Holmes moved further into the room, inspecting each surface with his usual intensity. "Whoever was involved in this had to know exactly what they were looking for," he muttered, "and they were not concerned with preserving Whitmore's work, only with ensuring that no trace of it would remain." A sense of urgency filled the space as I began to understand the true weight of the investigation. Holmes was right. Whatever had happened here was far from ordinary. As we continued to explore the laboratory, I turned my attention to a desk in the far corner where a collection of papers and notebooks was strewn across the surface. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that the desk had been disturbed recently. Papers were half-finished, scraps of writing crossed out in haste, and the contents of several drawers were hastily dumped out, as though someone had been searching for something in particular. Holmes's keen eyes soon alighted upon an open notebook, its pages filled with detailed notes and chemical formulas. As I leaned in to inspect it further, I saw that several pages had been ripped out, their jagged edges torn as though someone had intended to hide what had once been recorded on them. Curious, Holmes said, his voice calm but tinged with interest. It would appear that our thief was not merely after the vial or the experiments, but also Whitmore's research. Someone wanted to erase his work, not just his physical presence. I nodded, my hand brushing over the remaining pages, but a sudden thought struck me. Holmes, if they were so keen to destroy his research, why leave this behind? I gestured to the notebook in front of us. Why not take it all? Holmes bent closer, his eyes scanning the notebook with the precision of a hawk. Because, Watson, there is something here, something they missed. A single clue remains, hidden in plain sight. He flipped through the remaining pages, pausing at one in particular. This is the key. It is incomplete, yet there is enough here to suggest Whitmore was on the verge of discovering something critical, a compound that could change everything. It seems our thief had not counted on leaving behind such a telling fragment. I felt a shiver of unease ripple down my spine. We were closing in on something far larger than a mere murder. The mystery of Whitmore's death had just taken on a new, darker significance. Holmes stood over Whitmore's scattered papers, his keen eyes moving rapidly across the pages. His long fingers brushed over them lightly, as if he could glean meaning from touch alone. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he plucked a faded medical journal from the pile and turned it over in his hands. "Here, Watson," he murmured. This was no accident. The journal itself appeared unremarkable, save for a slight bulge in the spine where something had been carefully inserted. With a precise movement, Holmes pried it open, revealing a single yellowed sheet, folded and pressed between the pages. I leaned in as he unfolded the brittle paper, revealing a complex arrangement of chemical symbols and equations, written in a hurried yet practiced hand. At the top, underlined twice, was the name Etheris X. "What do you make of it?" I asked, watching as Holmes's eyes scanned the intricate formula. "It is exactly what I expected, Watson," he replied. "Whitmore's work was far from ordinary chemistry. This is something revolutionary, perhaps even dangerous." He tapped a long finger against the page. "Notice the molecular structure here. Stabilized compounds, neuroreactive agents. This is the work of a man walking the razor's edge between scientific progress and ethical peril." I felt a creeping unease. But why hide it in such a manner? If Whitmore had discovered something valuable, would he not have wished to publish it? Holmes's lips pressed together. Perhaps, but this was not meant for publication. This was hidden, deliberately, and not just from prying eyes, but from those who might seek to use it. He held the paper to the dim light. He knew it was dangerous, that much is clear. I exhaled slowly. Then we are no longer dealing with just a murder, Holmes. This is something much greater. Holmes folded the paper carefully. "Indeed, Watson. And now, we must determine exactly what Whitmore created, before others use it for far darker purposes." Holmes had taken a seat by the dim lamp, his sharp gaze fixed on the formula before him. He examined it with the intensity of a man decoding a cryptic message, his mind unraveling the meaning behind Whitmore's research. "Etheris X," he murmured. "A most curious name." I watched as he traced a line of symbols with his finger. "Here, Watson. This compound, note the structure. It is not merely a chemical agent. It is a neurostimulant, designed to target the nervous system directly." I frowned. "A form of anesthesia, then?" Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. Anesthesia dulls the senses. It numbs pain. But this heightens response while simultaneously suppressing distress. A most peculiar contradiction." He leaned back slightly, tapping his temple in thought. "Imagine a man stabbed through the gut, his body registering the trauma, yet his mind unable to perceive it as suffering. Instead, he experiences exhilaration, perhaps even euphoria. That, Watson, is the nature of Etheris X. A chill ran through me. Then that explains Whitmore's laughter. Holmes nodded. Precisely. The drug disrupts the body's normal response to pain, not by removing sensation, but by altering perception. The body is in agony, yet the mind experiences pleasure or detachment, a truly dangerous invention in the wrong hands. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. But Holmes, what possible reason could Whitmore have had for developing such a thing? Holmes's expression darkened. That is the question, is it not? Perhaps an experiment in advanced pain management, a treatment for extreme trauma, or more sinister still, a tool for manipulation, a means to render men impervious to pain, yet dangerously detached from reality. I felt my stomach turn at the implications. Then his death was no accident. He knew too much. Holmes folded the paper with great care and slipped it inside his coat. Indeed, Watson, Whitmore was not merely a victim. He was a man who held a secret that others would kill to possess. Holmes sat in silence for several moments, the formula for Aetheris X resting between his fingers like a puzzle that only he could unravel. I could see the flickering intensity in his gaze, the precise manner in which his mind processed each variable, considering all possible implications before settling upon the most logical, yet most unsettling conclusion. At first glance, he said at last, one might believe that Whitmore pursued this research for noble purposes, an advancement in medical science, a new method of pain suppression. But does that align with what we have seen, Watson? I frowned, recalling the grim events leading up to this moment. You mean the theft of the vial? The destruction of his notes? Precisely, Holmes replied. If Whitmore had intended for his work to be a great boon to mankind, why hide it? Why take such great pains to keep it from prying eyes? A true scientific discovery does not inspire theft and secrecy, but rather publication and acclaim. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Then you believe his research was being used for something darker? Holmes tapped a finger against the paper. I do, and so did Whitmore. That is why he hid it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a measured whisper. This compound, Aetheris X, is not merely an anesthetic. It is a weapon. Imagine, Watson, an army that feels no pain. Soldiers who march forward, wounded and bleeding, yet utterly detached from their suffering. Or criminals who laugh in the face of torture, rendering all coercion useless. A shiver passed over me. But surely such a thing would be impossible, ethically unthinkable. Holmes gave a thin, humorless smile. And yet, here it is. Whitmore created it. And now, he is dead. He steepled his fingers. There is only one explanation that fits. He did not create it willingly. I exhaled, feeling the noose of the mystery tighten. Then the question remains, who forced his hand? Holmes nodded. And what did they intend to do with his discovery? Neither of us spoke the answer aloud, but in that moment, I knew we were entangled in something far greater than we had imagined. Holmes sat at his desk, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair in rapid succession. The dim glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, but his mind was alight with purpose. I had seen him like this before, on the precipice of revelation, when all the scattered pieces of a puzzle began to align into a coherent whole. The time has come, Watson, he said suddenly, his voice sharp with resolve. We shall draw our adversary into the open. He reached for a sheet of paper, and with his characteristic precision, began to write. A coded message, carefully constructed, meant to serve as both bait and challenge. To Dr. Samuel Royce, he muttered as he wrote, a proposition of utmost urgency. The formula has been decoded. Aetheris X, in its entirety, preserved. Those who wish to claim it may do so, for a price. A meeting must be arranged. I stared at him in disbelief. Holmes, are you truly offering to sell the formula? He looked up, amusement flickering in his sharp grey eyes. Not at all, Watson. but I shall allow them to believe I am. I exhaled. And what if they call your bluff? Holmes smiled. They shall not, my dear fellow, for they cannot afford to. Whoever is behind this conspiracy has already gone to great lengths to ensure that Aetheris X does not fall into the wrong hands, or rather any hands but their own. By suggesting that the formula is intact, we force them into action. They will come for it, and in doing so, they will reveal themselves. He folded the letter carefully and sealed it with a practiced motion. This message, Watson, will set our trap, and when the time comes, we shall be waiting. I felt a familiar sense of tension settle over me, the knowledge that we were stepping into the unknown, that danger lay ahead. Yet as I looked at Holmes, calm and unshaken, I knew that the game was finally reaching its end. The night was bitterly cold as we made our way toward the rendezvous point, a deserted warehouse on the banks of the Thames. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and stagnant water, and the tide lapped softly against the rotting piers. It was a place chosen with care, isolated, shrouded in shadows, perfect for a clandestine meeting. Holmes walked ahead with his usual confidence, his coat drawn tightly around him. I followed, my hand resting instinctively near the revolver in my pocket. "You are certain they will come?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me. "They must, Watson. They have no choice." A single lantern had been placed inside the warehouse, casting an eerie glow across the wooden beams. We stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath our weight, and then we waited. Minutes passed in silence. Then, from the darkness, came the sound of approaching footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. Holmes did not move. I tensed, my fingers brushing the revolver's handle. The footsteps grew louder until, at last, a figure emerged from the gloom. Sir Leopold Harrington. I felt my breath catch. The distinguished surgeon stood before us, his face calm, unreadable. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided the course of action he would take. Holmes's voice was light when he spoke. "Ah, Sir Leopold, how good of you to join us." Harrington gave a small, cold smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I must say, I expected more subtlety from you." Holmes tilted his head. "And I expected better from you, Sir Leopold. A man of your intellect should have known that secrets never remain buried for long." Harrington exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Let us not play games. You claim to have the formula. I have come to retrieve it." Holmes smiled. "Oh, I have no doubt of that." I felt my pulse quicken. The final act had begun. For a moment, the warehouse stood in perfect silence. The confrontation had begun, yet neither side had made its move. Sir Leopold Harrington regarded us with the quiet assurance of a man who still believed himself to be in control, his gloved hands resting lightly at his sides. "I shall not insult your intelligence, Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly. "Clearly, you have pieced together a portion of the truth. But tell me, what is it that you think you know?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a rare intensity. "I know that Charles Whitmore did not die at random," he said. "Nor was he murdered for money, revenge, or passion. He died because he created something that was never meant to exist." A flicker of amusement crossed Harrington's features. "You do flatter the man. He was clever, I admit, but prone to moralistic sentiment. That was his downfall." Holmes tilted his head. "And was it you who ensured that downfall?" Harrington exhaled softly. It was necessary. Whitmore was a brilliant chemist, but he failed to see the opportunity before him. He was content to tinker away in obscurity, but when I approached him with my proposal, he could hardly refuse. I felt my hands clench into fists at his unapologetic arrogance. "You forced him into it?" Harrington gave a dismissive wave. "I funded his research, Dr. Watson. I provided him with the resources that allowed him to perfect Aetheris X. What I asked in return was simple: to refine it into a marketable anesthetic, one that could be sold to those willing to pay. There are always buyers for such things, men who require alternative solutions to pain. And Whitmore? Holmes asked quietly. The cold amusement in Harrington's eyes darkened. He lost his resolve. He began muttering about the dangers of Aetheris X, speaking of side effects, of consequences. The fool intended to expose my operations, so I arranged for a different outcome. I felt a surge of fury. You had him killed, Harrington shrugged. I ensured the formula remained where it belonged. Whitmore's mistake was believing he had the power to undo what was already done. Holmes gave the smallest of nods. And yours, Sir Leopold, was believing that you could conceal the truth forever. Sir Leopold Harrington's smirk did not waver. And what will you do, Holmes? You have no evidence. My word against yours. The formula is gone. Whitmore is dead. And you, gentlemen, are standing alone in the dark. Holmes's expression did not change, yet I sensed the shift, a subtle certainty, an unshakable confidence that Harrington had already lost. Alone, Holmes mused. You misunderstand, Sir Leopold. You see, I never intended to be alone. It was then that I heard it, the rustle of movement in the shadows, the faint sound of boots against wood. A figure stepped forward, then another, until from the darkness emerged Inspector Lestrade and a half-dozen officers of Scotland Yard. Harrington stiffened, his mask of control faltering for the first time. What? Your confession, Holmes said, his voice light. It has been heard and recorded in full. He gestured toward Lestrade, whose expression was grim. And I believe the good inspector has a rather pressing matter to discuss with you. For a moment, Harrington did not move. Then, in a last act of desperation, his hand darted toward his coat pocket, but Holmes was faster. With a swift motion, he knocked the weapon aside, sending it clattering to the ground. Lestrade stepped forward, two officers seizing Harrington by the arms. Sir Leopold Harrington, you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Whitmore. Holmes turned to me, a satisfied gleam in his eye. And that, Watson, is the conclusion of our most peculiar case. The case of Charles Whitmore had come to its dramatic conclusion. Yet, as we returned to the familiar warmth of 221B Baker Street, I found that my mind remained troubled. The grim events of the past few days lingered with me. Whitmore's eerie laughter, the theft of the vial, Harrington's chilling confession, and though justice had been served, there remained a disquieting air about it all. Holmes, however, seemed entirely unburdened by sentiment. He sat in his armchair, legs stretched before him, lighting his pipe with his usual indifference, as though we had merely returned from an evening stroll rather than an encounter with a murderer. You seem restless, Watson, he observed, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. I shook my head. It is the nature of it all, Holmes. The thought that a man could create something so terrible, only to be silenced by those who sought to profit from it. It is not a case that sits easily with me. Holmes gave a slight shrug. Science, my dear Watson, is but a tool, neither good nor evil in itself. It is men such as Harrington who decide whether it shall be used for healing or harm. In this case, his ambition far outweighed his conscience. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. And yet I cannot help but feel that Whitmore's tragedy was inevitable. He created something beyond his own control. Holmes gave a small smile. Perhaps. But he at least attempted to set things right in the end. A pity that he did not act sooner. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain pattered softly against the window, and I wondered if the secrets of Aetheris X had truly been buried with Whitmore, or if, like all things, they would one day resurface. I had nearly finished my evening brandy when Holmes, who had remained quiet for some time, suddenly stirred in his chair. He reached for a small wooden box upon the table, flipping open the lid to reveal several glass slides. Tell me, Watson, he said, holding one up to the lamplight. Have you given much thought to the blue residue found beneath Whitmore's fingernails? I straightened slightly. It was some form of chemical stain, was it not? Holmes nodded. Precisely, and yet few considered its significance, save for the man who took the vial from my study. He placed the slide back in the box and turned to me. That stain, Watson, was a stabilizing agent used in the synthesis of Atheris X. Whitmore had been handling it himself, quite possibly mere moments before his murder. A chill ran through me. Then, he dosed himself? Holmes inclined his head. Unknowingly, I suspect. Likely, he was testing his own formula, oblivious to the fact that he had already been marked for death. When the blade struck, his mind did not register pain, only an unnatural euphoria. That is why he laughed, Watson. It was not madness. It was chemistry. I exhaled slowly. A cruel irony. Holmes took a final draw from his pipe. A most unfortunate one. The man who sought to cure pain became its greatest victim. I stared into the fire, knowing that this case would haunt me for many nights to come. Holmes sat in his chair, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the embers glowing in the hearth. For a long moment, he said nothing, allowing the weight of the case to settle between us. Then, at last, he spoke. You see, Watson, the true tragedy of Charles Whitmore's fate was not simply that he was murdered, but that he died without ever knowing he was dying. I watched him closely, sensing that the final revelation was near. You recall the blue stains beneath his fingernails? Holmes continued. That was a stabilizing compound, a crucial ingredient in the synthesis of Atheris X. It was absorbed into his system while he worked, likely through direct contact with his skin. I sat forward. Then, he had already been dosed before the attack? Holmes nodded. Precisely. When his assailant struck, Whitmore's nervous system had already succumbed to the effects of his own creation. His body registered the trauma, yet his mind, detached from pain, responded not with agony, but with laughter. A chill ran through me as the terrible irony became clear. Then the very compound he sought to control was the reason he felt nothing at all. Holmes exhaled slowly. And the reason he never even tried to defend himself. He was laughing, Watson. Laughing, even as he bled out, because his own invention had stolen from him the ability to understand his own suffering. The thought was deeply unsettling. Whitmore had died not in terror nor in rage, but in blissful ignorance of his own murder. A cruel fate, I murmured. Holmes, lighting his pipe, gave a slow nod. Cruel indeed, Watson, and yet it was his own hand that sealed it. For a long while, I stared into the fire, my thoughts heavy with the weight of the case. Holmes had untangled every thread, laid bare every secret, but the answer was no comfort. Whitmore had sought to eliminate pain, yet in the end, he had merely numbed himself to the truth of his own demise. As I sat lost in thought, Holmes exhaled a curl of smoke and murmured, almost to himself, "A most unfortunate irony, Watson. The man who sought to cure pain became its greatest victim, and with that, the case was closed." As the last embers of the fire flickered in the hearth, I found myself still pondering the events that had unfolded. The case had been solved, justice had been served, and yet there remained a lingering unease, a quiet spectre of irony that could not be ignored. Holmes, ever unshaken by sentiment, tapped the ash from his pipe and regarded me with an almost imperceptible smile. "You seem troubled, Watson," he observed. I exhaled slowly. "It is Whitmore's fate that haunts me, Holmes. A man who sought to free others from suffering, yet in the end, his own discovery robbed him of his final moments, a victim of his own creation." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "There is a certain poetic justice in it, is there not? The scientist blinded by his own genius, the criminal undone by his own arrogance. It is a pattern I have seen time and again, Watson. Men who believe themselves masters of fate, only to be ensnared by their own hands." His gaze turned toward the window, where the London fog curled thickly against the glass. But the world moves on, Watson. There will always be another puzzle, another man who believes he can outwit consequence. He leaned back, his voice carrying the faintest hint of amusement. And there will always be those of us who remind him otherwise. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Still, I wonder, Holmes, what do you think was Harrington's greatest mistake? Holmes let out a quiet chuckle. Ah, Watson, that is for sharper minds to decide. And now, dear reader, I put the question to you. What do you believe was the fatal flaw in Sir Leopold Harrington's scheme? Was it his overconfidence, his underestimation of Whitmore, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures and share this case with fellow detectives who might enjoy the thrill of deduction. And remember, in every crime there is always one fatal mistake. The trick is knowing where to look.